Uh, Today we are going to finish Exodus. Sincerely hope. So last time with this group, I got through the. I got to the Red Sea, right? Did we cross the Red Sea yet? Okay, we got to the Red Sea. All right. So we got finished with the 10 plagues. We got out of Egypt, and we were leaving Egypt. So the people were. God gave did the 10 plagues to Egypt, and on the last day, or the last of the plagues, was the death of the firstborn, and God gave them the ritual of Passover to be able to put blood on the doorpost, and death passes over those houses, and also it prepares them. They get ready to leave, and the next morning, sure enough, death has come over Egypt, including to Pharaoh's house, and Pharaoh's finally had enough and kicks them out. And so they start traveling, they start going, they leave, and they're given the treasures, the jewelry, and the valuables from Egypt. When they ask their neighbors for gifts, the common people, or the people of Egypt, seem to be well disposed to the Hebrews, recognize that there's been all of this mistreatment, and all these things have been done to them, and so they give them these gifts, and jewelry, and gold, and silver, and they travel, and they leave, and God has them go to the Red Sea, and camp on the near bank of the Red Sea, and knowing that Pharaoh is going to look out and see them there and think that here they are, they've just left Egypt, now they're lost, and they don't know where they're going, and so they're just going to wander around in the wilderness. And so Pharaoh decides, gets bold again, and he's angry at the situation, angry what's happened, angry at the death of his son, and he decides he's going to send out his army, and he's getting those Hebrews back. And so he sends out the army after them, and the army is coming up on the Hebrew camp, and the people are starting to the Hebrew people are starting to kind of panic and freak out. And Moses, did you bring us out here into the wilderness just to let us die again? To let us die out here? It would have been better if we just stayed, if we were going to get chased down by Pharaoh and brought back anyway, and people killed along the way. And so God tells Moses that just to be patient and to stretch his hand, his staff out over the water. And when he does, God causes the water to split. And the water parts and makes this really long, dry aisleway down the middle of the water, down the middle of the ocean, the sea. And the people will start to cross. And as they're crossing, the pillar, God's presence is going before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And all of a sudden, this pillar of cloud that's been going in front of them pops up and drops behind them and confounds the army. They can't keep after them. And it stays there and fights Pharaoh's army until the entire camp of the Hebrews has gotten to go down into the water and is crossing, is going up the other side. And then the pillar of cloud vanishes and pops over and goes back ahead of the camp of the Hebrews. And now the way is open. This army can start chasing after the Hebrews. And they look ahead and they see that the Hebrews are crossing through this sea, but they're still down there and they can catch up. And so they start racing after them to catch up, and Pharaoh sends the army down into the sea, the sea bottom anyway, and God keeps messing up their chariots, and so wheels keep bumping and popping and getting stuck and not being able to go. And so instead of being able to chase them and catch up with them, the Israelites, the Hebrews, are able to get out on the other side and get back to dry land, and the army is still in the bottom of the seabed with the walls of water on each side of them. And then God tells Moses to stretch his staff back out over the water, and when Moses does, the walls collapse and the water comes rushing back in on the army and destroys it. The army is just wiped out, drowned, chariots left on the bottom of the sea. And actually the bodies of some of these soldiers, of the Egyptian soldiers, washes up on the shore, and the Israelites strip them of their weapons and armor, and that's how they get armed. That's how they get weapons. And so then they're on the other side of the sea. Pharaoh's army's been decimated, nearly wiped out, and they're free to go. Now, we didn't have this last part of the story, and so I didn't mention this last time, but if you think about what has happened up to this point in this story, the Hebrews were in slavery in Egypt, and they basically ended up executing the most successful slave revolt in history. They were a massive number of people in slavery, and they leave as an intact group. They're not broken up into bands, they're not splintered and spread out as a people. They leave the country as an intact group. They take wealth with them. They plunder the Egyptians, as it's described in the text. They take wealth with them, and they defeat the army of their oppressors, and they do it all without having a weapon in their hands. They don't do any of it themselves. God does it all for them. They have the most successful slave revolt in history without actually fighting at all, without actually lifting a weapon of their own. God fights for them, as the text says. And so they get to the other side of the water. They're on the other side of the Red Sea, and now they have to go, and they're traveling through the wilderness. There's a chapter of celebration, and did y'all just see this? Did you see what God did? And songs from Moses and his sister Miriam. But then they start to travel, and thank you, ma'am. Head on out whenever you're in. They set out to travel, and they're going to Mount Sinai, which is in the Sinai Peninsula. And if you imagine, it would be great if I had a map, but I don't. In the northwest or northeast corner of Israel, or not of Israel, the northeast corner of Africa is where Egypt is situated, right? And then between Egypt and where Israel, Palestine is, or where the land of Canaan is, where God has promised to give them the land, the promised land that they're going to, between there is the Sinai Peninsula, which is a roughly triangular shaped peninsula in between. So you've got this roughly triangular shaped chunk of land in between Egypt and Israel, where they're going. And they begin to travel, and they go down, I'm forgetting to switch hands. They go down south into the very southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula to Mount Sinai. And then after they leave Mount Sinai, they're going to go back up and into the Promised Land, or towards the Promised Land. And this is a journey that's going to take some time. And this is a group of about 1 million people that have just left everything behind them except for what they could carry. And they all have the clothes on their back and the bread that they carried out of Egypt, but they've been eating on that as they traveled to the Red Sea and then through. And they don't have enough water, but basically they just don't have enough of anything. They don't have enough clothes, they don't have enough food, they don't have enough water, and there's 1 million of them. It's not easy to provide for 1 million people anywhere, especially in the desert. And so the people start complaining about the things that they don't have. They start complaining about how hard the travel is and how hot it is, and they complain about the lack of water, that they don't have enough water to survive. And that they start saying things like, it would be better if we had stayed in Egypt and if we had remained as slaves. I mean, at this point, we're just days to weeks out of the Red Sea crossing, where God miraculously parted the waters and destroyed an entire army right in front of them. And they're complaining and saying they should go back, that God isn't going to take care of us. Moses, why have you brought us out here to die? So they're traveling through the wilderness, and they don't have enough of anything, and they start grumbling and complaining. And God provides for them. God gives them exactly what they need when they need it, but they're grumbling and complaining the whole way. And so, for instance, they run out of water, they don't have enough water, they're afraid they're going to die of dehydration. They come across this spring and they start to try to drink from it, and it's bitter and it has something in it that is poisonous. It's going to hurt them to drink it. And so they really start grumbling and complaining, here's water, we can't even drink it, why did you bring us out here to die? And God tells Moses to take a stick and throw it in the water, and when Moses throws the stick in the water, it's purified. And now everybody can drink. And another time, a little later, they're out of water again, and there's nowhere around for water. And people start complaining once again, why did you bring us out here to die? It would be better for us to stay in Egypt, blah, 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 blah. And God tells Moses to take his staff and whack the rock. And so Moses takes his staff and he whacks the rock, and the rock cracks open and water comes rushing out of it. There's a spring comes out of the rock, enough to give water to 1 million people. And so God provides water for them. And the people are complaining, well, we don't have food, we don't have bread, how are we supposed to eat out here? It would have been better if we stayed in Egypt. There we got to sit around these pots of meat, and we could eat much meat as we want. It'd be better to be slaves in Egypt than to die out here in the desert. And so God sends them food miraculously. In the evenings, God sends these flocks of quail that come through, and there's so many, and it comes through so thick, and quail are relatively small, kind of dove-like or pigeon-like birds that you can eat, decent eating. And so these flocks of quail come through, and the flocks are so thick, there's so many of them, that people just go outside with sticks and swing. And they hit enough birds to feed their family, and just by going out and swinging a stick around in the air when the flocks are coming through. And actually, God appears to be getting a little annoyed with all of the complaining, and tells them that they will have meat, and they will have meat until it's running out of their nose. So these big flocks of quail come through, and they start whacking at the air, and they get quail, and they eat quail. And then God sends every morning, there's this cloud or this dew that comes up over the earth, over the land, and when the dew leaves or evaporates, there's this white crusty stuff left behind. And God tells them to go and harvest it and make bread from it. And so they go out, and the first day that they go out to look at it, they're looking around, and there's all this, this white crusty stuff all over everything. And they look at it and they say, "What is this? What is this? What is it?" But God tells them to harvest it, to get it, and to grind it up, and then use it basically as flour to make bread. And when they make bread out of it, they find that it's not just, it doesn't just work, it tastes really good. It tastes like bread that's been sweetened with honey. And so they collect it and they eat it every day, and the name sticks. The name manna means, what is it? That kind of first initial reaction they had to it is, what is this stuff? That name sticks, and so they call it manna. So they eat this manna day by day. And God has this kind of peculiar requirement around it, what seems like a peculiar requirement to us. God tells them that they must not collect more than they need for the day. And there's a particular measure that they're supposed to use. And it says that when they collect this measure, it always works out to be enough for the person. And so for each person in your household, you're supposed to collect an omer of the manna. And they collect it, and they make it into bread, and it's always the right amount. It's enough. If you get this much of this stuff, you will get what this person needs. And so they do it, but of course, there's always some that are not going to follow the rules, not going to do what they're told. And so some start collecting this massive amount of it. They get up a whole bunch of it, and they make their bread for one day, and they get up the next morning thinking, we've already got ours collected. We don't want to have to wait and see what happens. The next morning they get up, and the extra that they have collected has rotted, and it stinks to high heaven, and there's maggots in it. It's disgusting. And so every day they have to go out and collect what they need for that day. And the exception to that is God tells them that on the 6th day of the week, they're to collect enough for 2 days and then rest on the Sabbath, on the 7th day. And so the 7th day they're to rest. And so on day 6, they collect enough for 2 days, and it doesn't rot the next day. But if they ever collect more than they're supposed to, and any of it's left over until the next day, it goes putrefied and is disgusting. That may kind of lead to a question: why does God do this? Why does God tell them only to collect what they need for one day, and then have this kind of disgusting enforcement mechanism?
Why does God listen to them complain and then provide? I thought He doesn't like people to complain. So why does He provide people complaining?
He doesn't like people complaining, and their complaining often has consequences. And in a lot of cases, like this case, the people's complaining is coming just before God is going to provide anyway. And so sometimes there's consequences immediately, and sometimes there's not. Sometimes they complain. In one case, they complain and the earth opens up and swallows a bunch of them. But that's coming in a later book. And so God doesn't always punish them immediately or always have consequences for their complaining, but often enough it does. And so it's still pretty clear that God doesn't like the complaining. And the whole meat will be running out of your nose comment that God tells them they'll have so much meat it'll be running out of their nose is an indication that God isn't really pleased with this. But God recognizes that they do need food and water in the desert, and so He's providing it anyway. And the way that God specifically goes about providing for it is at least partially to break them of the complaining and the constant whining and the distrust. Because the requirement, why does God only allow them to pick up the amount that they need for any given day? So they will come to learn to trust Him day by day. They will come to trust him to provide what they need for each day. It's real hard to argue that that's extremely successful. The people are still complaining and they're still grumbling, and the consequences for it get to be more serious as time goes on. But it does teach them. They do learn to depend on God for the manna day by day, and to depend on God for provision, even if they don't give up grumbling, really. But I mean, yeah, good question. Why does God put up with it? I mean, my patience would wear thin real fast. But God does tolerate at least some of the grumbling, knowing that they need what God's about to provide anyway. So God provides what they need all the way through the wilderness, whether it's water through the miraculous healing or purifying of a spring, or the whacking of a rock to produce a new spring, or manna and quail to provide food, or in one case there's a group of another tribe that comes out to attack them, named the Amalekites, and the Amalekites come out to attack them, and God gives them this miraculous victory that involves Moses holding his hands up. And as long as Moses is holding his staff up in the air, the Israelites are winning, and when his arms get tired and he starts to put them down, the Amalekites start winning. And so he eventually has to have two guys stand on each side of him and help hold his arms up. And so, but as long as his arms are up, the Israelites win. And so God gives them this miraculous victory over this foreign tribe as they're wandering through the wilderness. I mean, none of them have been trained as warriors, so they, by all rights, they probably should be pretty easy to slaughter, but God gives them the victory. And eventually, it takes about 3 months to corral this whole group and get them to Mount Sinai, with God doing all this and providing for them all through the wilderness. And, of course, it takes 3 months to get 1 million people traveling through the wilderness. If you ever tried to organize any group of people to travel anywhere, it's complicated. I can't get me and the 4 members of my household anywhere without being 15 minutes late because of how long it takes to get children buckled into a car seat. And so I can imagine trying to get 1 million people organized and marching and going anywhere. So it takes about 3 months for them to get to Mount Sinai. And then when they get there, God gives them this command. He tells Moses that on 3 days from that day, 3 days from their arrival, God's presence is going to come on the mountain. That they come to Mount Sinai, and they're down below Mount Sinai in the valley in front of it, and God says, in 3 days my presence will come on this mountain, and once my presence is there, no one can stand on the mountain, no one can approach the mountain. If even an animal tries to climb on the mountain, it must be killed. No one can come onto the mountain when my presence is there, or they will die. And God tells them to spend the next 3 days preparing themselves and consecrating themselves to prepare for God's presence. And so they do. And then on the 3rd day, God's presence comes on the mountain, and there is this dark cloud that comes over the mountain, and there's thunderings and lightnings and earthquakes and rumblings all over the mountain, all in the mountain, thunder. It's an impressive scene and scares the mess out of the people. And then God calls Moses to come partway up the mountain, and still in sight of the people, and where the people can still see and hear, and God starts to speak to Moses. And the people are freaked out that the way God speaks, what God does when he speaks, the cloud, the lightnings, the thunders, the voice of God, they are panicked, freaked out. And so when Moses comes back down afterwards, after talking to God, the people ask Moses basically to talk to God for them from now on, because they don't think they can talk to God and live. It's like, you go talk to God, and then you come back and tell us what he says, because we don't want to talk to God. If we talk to God, we're going to die. And so Moses agrees, and he speaks to God on behalf of the people. And so Moses goes back up the mountain. God calls him, and he goes back up the mountain, and God gives him the basics of the covenant. Tells them what commands, what the commandments will be, the basic things that they have to obey, and the basic things that they have to do, and what their relationship with God will be if they agree, if they form this covenant with God. And so he goes up, and as part of that, God gives Moses the 10 commandments. So he goes up and he hears the commandments, he hears some other regulations, and he hears about the things that God wants the people to do and what that relationship is going to be like, and that if they will obey God, if they will follow the commandments and do what God says, they'll be led into this great and prosperous land. They'll become a very prosperous people, and God will do all these great things for them if they will do sir. If they will do what God tells them to do, God will do all these great things for them. But they have to obey the commandments. And so Moses comes back down the mountain, having talked with God and gotten these instructions, and this is the nature of the covenant. This is what God is going to do for the people if you will agree, if you will keep your end of the bargain. And so he comes down and he asks the people, tells them, this is what God said. Do you want to do this? Do you want to be in a relationship with God? Are you willing to obey these commandments to be in a relationship with this God and to get these benefits, for God to give you these blessings? Do you want to enter into this covenant? And the people and the leaders all shout, yes, we want to be in this relationship. We want to make this covenant. We want God to be our God. And so Moses takes, at God's instruction, Moses takes an animal and slaughters it and collects blood into 2 bowls. And they build an altar there on the side of the mountain, in the sight of the people. And Moses takes the blood from one bowl and dashes it against the side of the altar. And that is, representatively, that is God's part of the covenant, God's end of the covenant ceremony. And then he takes the other bowl full of blood and he takes it and he sprinkles it over the top of the people. And that is their part of the covenant ceremony. And so both sides of the covenant have been washed in blood. They've been sprinkled in blood. And in fact, he holds it up and says, this is the blood of the covenant. And so this is, if you remember back in Genesis with Abraham splits these animals in half and walks down that aisle, and that's the covenant-making ceremony that God does with Abraham. And Abraham was unconscious on the side. He didn't have any part of it. It was just God's promise. Here, God is establishing another kind of covenant, or he's using another kind of covenant ceremony for the same effect. But this time, both sides agree. Both sides have a part. And the people of Israel have to agree to obey God's commandments, to get the benefits, or to be in the relationship, be in the covenant. And they do. And so then God tells Moses to bring 2 stone tablets and to come up the mountain, and he will carve into those tablets by God's own hand. And God's own hand will carve these commandments and the terms of the covenant for the people to keep forever and to know for sure that this is God has done it. And so Moses goes up the mountain, and he's up on the mountain for about a month. He's up there for about 30 days, receiving the commandments that God is giving. That God carves the 10 commandments into the stone and carves in the rest of the instructions for the covenant, and he receives instructions for how to build the tabernacle and specific commandments for dealing with all kinds of different situations, different relationships among people, masters and slaves, men and women, what to do if you accidentally kill somebody else's animal, and all kinds of stuff specified. What is the law of this people supposed to be? What is their national law supposed to look like? And gives him all these instructions, and then at the end of the 30 days, at getting all of these commands and commandments and the stone tablets carved, God looks at Moses and says, you have to go down now. The people have become corrupt. And what has happened in the last couple of days that Moses is up on the mountain is the people have come to Moses' brother-in-law Aaron, and they come to him and they said, make gods for us. And what I haven't mentioned up to this point is that this period that Moses is up on the mountain that takes 30 days, there's about 12 chapters of material in Exodus dedicated to what God says to him and the instructions that God gives to him in that 30 days. And among that 30 days of instructions that God gives is the consecration of the priesthood. And God points to Aaron, Moses' brother-in-law, and says he is to be the first high priest, and all of the priests of Israel would descend from Aaron. And so actually the priesthood of Israel after this, the priesthood that serves in the tabernacle and then later the temple, is called the Aaronic priesthood because it descends from Aaron. And so Aaron, God has already selected and picked out Aaron to be the first high priest, the one to lead the people in worship of God. And so the people come to Aaron, who has been singled out for this, not yet knowing fully. But the people come to him and say, make gods for us. This is, we want to worship something, we want to worship God, and to worship gods that, to bring us, that brought us up out of Egypt, that did all this for us. And so we want to worship gods. Now, keep in mind, they're still at Mount Sinai. The presence of God is still there. They can look up and see this immense dark cloud with lightning and thunder all in it, day in, day out. It's there. They can see this physical representation of God's presence, and they can't walk on the mountain unless they die. They got abundant reason to know that God's still close by. And we're a month into their stay at Sinai, and it took them 3 months to get to Sinai from the Red Sea, which means that we're less than half a year from all of the stuff that God has done for them already in Exodus. The 10 plagues to get them out of Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea miraculously and the wiping out of the army, all of the provision in the desert with manna and quail and multiple sources of water, the victory over the Amalekites, all of that. God has done all of that, and it's all been less than 6 months. And now here they are on the mountain looking up. There's the giant black dark cloud with all the lightning in it that shows very clearly that God is present. Make gods for us. And they say, as for this fellow Moses, we don't know what's happened to him. He's been gone 30 days. It led them for longer than that before they got there, but he's been gone 30 days. We don't know what's happened to him. And so Aaron gives in. He says, give me your gold earrings, the earrings that you get that were given to you when you came out of Egypt. And so they take all their gold earrings and they give them to Aaron, and he puts them in the fire, melts them down, and he forms this mold, and he shapes this gold into a calf, and then he uses tools to polish it and shape it down until it looks like a calf. And so he makes this golden calf. And the people begin to worship it and dance around it, and Aaron says, look, Israel, hear Israel, your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. While there's still lightning and thunder going on over them. How in the world? I mean, it's mind-boggling at this point to think, how in the world could they have gone this bad, gotten this dumb this fast? Because they've already been given the 2 commandments, and the first 2 are, have no other gods and make no idols. They're breaking the first 2 of the commandments within a month of having spilled the blood on the side of the altar and had it sprinkled over them, making this covenant with God, and with all that they have seen in the last 6 months. And so God tells Moses, you've got to go down. The people have become corrupt, and your brother-in-law Aaron is leading them, and you've got to go. And I may just kill them all and start over with you. I might just wipe them out and make you a great nation. Fulfill my promise to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob through you. And Moses pleads with God not to destroy his people, to not wipe them out, to bear with them. And so God agrees not to kill them. And Moses comes down the mountain, and he gets down to where he can see what's going on. He sees the golden calf. He sees all the rumbling and all the stuff going around. And he's got the young man Joshua with him, who is going to become very prominent later. Joshua's kind of Moses' right-hand man. And so Joshua's waiting partway up the mountain for him to come back down, and he comes back down with him, and they get there, and as they come up, Joshua says, it sounds like there's a battle in the camp. And Moses says, it's not a battle, but it sure is a defeat. And they come down, and they get to where they can see what's going on, and all the people dancing around this golden idol that they have made. And Moses takes the stone tablet of the covenant that God has given him, carved it with his own hand. God has carved this stone to make sure that they know in years to come what the covenant looks like. And he takes it and he shatters it on the ground. The people have already broken the covenant. Less than a month. And he goes down and he takes the idol and he throws it into the fire. And some part of it must be wood or something flammable, because it partially burns, and then he takes the rest and grinds it down into a powder and mixes it into people's water, and they have to drink it. They have to drink the idol that they made. And then he turns and confronts Aaron and says, why did you do this? And Aaron lies, and he says, these people, these stubborn people, they came to me and they demanded that I make an idol for them, and so I said, okay, give me your gold jewelry. And so I threw all the jewelry into the fire, and out popped this calf. No. The text actually describes him molding it, putting it into a cast, and working on it with tools. He didn't just throw the gold into the fire and miraculously there's a calf. But this is the story that he tells Moses. He shuffles responsibility. And Moses goes down and he calls out, anyone on the Lord's side, come to me. And all of the Levites, his own clan, comes to him. And he tells them, go and put on swords and walk through the camp and kill. Kill your brothers, kill your family, kill your friends, kill anybody you come across. Kill. And they do. And that night, as they go through the camp, about 3,000 are killed. Out of 1 million is not huge, right? It's 3%, but still, they're going through and they're killing their own people and people that they recognize and know. And this is part of judgment on them. Moses didn't just do this randomly. God said to. And then God also sends a plague to further afflict them. And more people die. But then God tells Moses to come back up on the mountain and bring 2 more stone tablets with him. Remember, the stone tablets, God carved those after they had agreed to the covenant. They had made the covenant with God, and so God was giving them a copy of the covenant in stone so that they would know forever what the covenant was supposed to be. It was this permanent reminder of what it was. And when they came down, when Moses came down, they had broken the covenant, and so he breaks the tablets. And God tells Moses to come back up the mountain with more stone tablets. Now, God has made sure there were consequences for their stupidity and for them messing up, but asking Moses to bring stone tablets back up so that God can carve another copy of the covenant is God giving the people of Israel another chance. He's giving them another chance to fulfill the covenant, to be in this covenant relationship with him. And so Moses comes back up, and God already knows what he's going to do because he told Moses to bring the 2 stone tablets, to carve 2 more stone tablets and bring them up with him. But when Moses gets there, God tells him, I'm going to send my angel ahead of you and lead you to the promised land, and I will fulfill my promises and give the promised land to your people, but I'm not going with you. I'll send my angel, but my presence is not going with you, because if my presence goes with you, I'll end up killing you all. And Moses begs and pleads for God to go with them, for his presence to go with them. In fact, he says, if your presence won't go, if you don't go with us, it would be better for us to remain here, for us to stay here at Mount Sinai. Now think about what that means. God has just offered to send an angel ahead of them to clear the way and to give them the land. And so they will have the land that they were promised, all the prosperity, all the wealth, all the good stuff that they were promised. God will make them a great nation. They'll be plentiful, and they'll get all of the good stuff that they were promised. If they go, it's just God won't go with them. And they won't have his presence among them. But they'll get all the stuff. They'll get all the blessings. They'll get all the stuff. And Moses says it would be better for us not to go and to stay here where we have next to nothing around this mountain, where we're living off of this white flaky stuff that comes on the ground and quail that comes flying through, and in constant terror of what might happen at this mountain, if we go on the mountain. It would be better for us to stay here in your presence with all of that and all of that hardship than to go and have all of these blessings without you. And so God agrees and promises not to send them and to go with them when they go up. And then Moses gets extra bold and asks God, says, show me your glory. So basically, show me yourself without any disguise, without anything between us. Let me see you. Show me your glory. And God replies to him and says, you'd die. You can't. No one can see me that way and live. But God says, instead, I'll put you in this crack in this rock, in this kind of crevice in the rock face, and I will cover it over with my hand, and I will pass away. And as I'm passing away, I'll remove my hand, and you will see kind of the trailing edge of my glory as I fade away, as my glory leaves and my glory fades away. You'll be able to see just that kind of trailing edge of my glory as it passes away. And it happens that way. There's all of this thunder and rumbling and lightning, and God has put Moses in this cleft in the rock and covered it over with his hand, and God pronounces his name, who he is, the Yahweh, the name that God has given to be remembered by forever, pronounces his name and says, I will have compassion on whom I have compassion, and show mercy to whom I show mercy. And God talks that I will punish those who defy me or who break my covenant, who don't keep my commandments. I will punish them to the 3rd generation, but I will show mercy to 1,000 generations of them that love me. And so there's this contrast between God's judgment and God's mercy, that judgment is intense, even to the 3rd generation. Your grandchildren will deal with the consequences of your actions, but 1,000 generations of those who love me. And that the mercy is unimaginably bigger than the judgment. And so God pronounces his name, and as passing away, Moses sees the trailing edge of God's glory as it fades away, and then he goes down the mountain. And when he gets down to the bottom of the mountain, the people around him start freaking out because Moses is glowing like a light bulb. He has seen the presence of God, he has seen the glory of God, and now his face is literally radiating light. He's shining. Not like the whole pregnant women are glowing kind of thing, like literally glowing. He's producing light. And the people are so freaked out by that they ask him to wear a veil until it goes away. And every time Moses, after that, goes into God's presence to speak to the people on behalf of the people, speak to God on behalf of the people, he comes out with his face shining, and the people know that he's been in God's presence, and they listen to what he says, and then he has to wear a veil until the glow stops. And so that's this narrative chunk anyway, but there's several things that we have skipped over, that 12 chapters of material in between, during the 30 days that he's on the mountain. So we need to backtrack and pick up a lot of that, or at least some of that. And initially, there's a good-sized chunk of that section that is dealing with various laws and regulations for all these various different kinds of relationships and situations, including what to do with marriage, and if a man seduces a woman, what he's required to do is basically he's required to marry her unless her father objects and absolutely refuses to allow them to marry, and then he has to pay the bride price as though they got married and not get married. And so there's these regulations for the treatment of women, and there's regulations for dealing with relations between people and over property. And if you loan an animal to somebody else and the animal dies or is stolen, what has to happen is they have to replace it. But if you leave your animal in somebody else's care while you go take care of something else and that animal is lost or stolen, then they aren't obligated. And so there's specifics like that, and then there's specifics over what kinds of things are capital offenses, what gets you killed, what gets you executed. And among those is if you commit premeditated murder, you choose to kill somebody, you plan and execute a murder, you die. If you kill somebody in anger, you die. If you kill somebody in self-defense, it depends. If somebody's breaking into your house in the middle of the night and you strike them and they die, that's fine. That's sensible. If it's after sunrise and the sun is up and you kill them when they're breaking into your house, you're guilty of their blood and you die. And so there's even self-defense has some limitations and such. And if you are kidnapping somebody to sell them as a slave, you die. Whether you have already sold them into slavery or you still have them, even if you still have them and they don't actually end up in slavery, you die because you kidnapped them to sell them into slavery. And so there's those things that are capital offenses, and then there's things regulating regulating slavery, regulating the relationship between masters and servants, and it's odd. It's very different than what we think of when we think of slavery because of our history with slavery in America and the African slave trade. Basically, my summary of the African slave trade is kidnapping and murder because that's what it was. But when slave was brought here, they were considered property, and there was no real consequence for killing a slave or for mistreating a slave or anything. They were property, and you could do with property whatever you wished. But the regulations in Exodus regarding slavery were very different. For example, they were still called property, but if you did anything to a slave that damaged them, that harmed them in something that they couldn't recover from in just a few days, you had to release them as payment. And so if you knocked out a slave's tooth, that permanently diminishes them just by a tooth, but you have permanently harmed them and they go free. They pay you, they owe nothing, they're free. And slavery had a maximum term, 7 years. At the end of 7 years, any slave in Israelite slave is set free. And there's no right, you have no right to transfer or to sell a slave outside of Israel. You can't sell a slave to a foreigner and try to bypass that whole 7 years thing or any other regulations. And the female slaves were a little different. There was no term limit for how long they remained as slaves, but if you refused to marry them or to give them to one of your sons in marriage, then any family member of theirs could buy them back at any time. And if they did get married, either to you if you bought them or to one of your sons, then they stopped being slaves and they were family. You had to treat them just as you would any other wife or any other daughter-in-law. And so the regulations were, in some ways, I mean, it's still slavery and not great, but way more progressive than and way more fair and a whole lot more built-in protections than what we had in America. And so there's a kind of surprising amount of consideration. So if you read through this section, you see the regulations. Some of them make you scratch your heads, and then some of them make you say, well, where did they come up with that early? You know, where did they come up with this far back? And God gave it to them. But then also, the bulk of this section is regulations and instructions for building the tabernacle, which is this place that the people are to worship. It's this large movable structure that the Levites, the tribe of Levi, is to break down and carry with them and set back up everywhere they go. And it's where God's presence is going to be among them and where they're to go to worship God. And so I have drawn a diagram for you. You know, I hope you appreciate my artwork here. It's, it's something. And the instructions, and there's all kinds of instructions in here for what materials are supposed to be used and how big everything is supposed to be and what color everything is supposed to be and what kind of decorations are supposed to be put in here. There's even regulations or specifically being told which two craftsmen are supposed to be in charge of the whole process and to be in charge over all the other craftsmen that work on the various materials. And so there's all these instructions for all of the various implements and everything that's to go in the tabernacle. But the basic shape and rundown, here you have this large area, and there's a surrounding tent wall. And it's kind of a separating barrier between the tabernacle and the rest of the camp. And these barriers were, I think, going to be probably about as tall as the walls of the chapel here. So that they'd be about 10, 12 feet tall, but there's no ceiling on them. They're just these tent dividers or these cloth dividers on poles. And so you have these poles spaced every so often, and there's a specific number of poles and a specific size of the panels in between them. But there's these poles set up and these panels between them that separate the tabernacle courtyard from the rest of the camp. And so you end up with this courtyard. And when you come in, if you were coming in the front of the tabernacle courtyard, there would be this second barrier so that you couldn't just look directly into the tabernacle from outside. You had to walk in and kind of go around and come in. And when you came in, the largest thing, the main thing that you would see at first is the altar, the place where the sacrifices were made. And we'll talk more about the sacrifices next time, because all the regulations for the sacrifices are given in Leviticus, and that's the next book. But you'd come in and there would be priests around the altar, and you would come in and you would bring whatever you were supposed to bring for the kind of sacrifice you were there for. And there were several different kinds of sacrifices. Again, we'll look at that in Leviticus. But the priest would be there, and you would bring your offering and talk to them about what kind of sacrifice you were there to make. And they would take your offering and they would do whatever was necessary to prepare it and get it ready. And then they would place whatever portion of it was supposed to go on the altar, and it would be consumed, burnt up on the altar, because the altar is on fire all the time. It's, there's huge amounts of wood and coal on it and coals on it to burn things. And so parts of animals, or the grain offerings that are brought, or even wine when it's brought as part of the offerings. There are lots of different kinds of offerings that involve different things. You bring it in, and some portion of it went on the altar to be directly an offering to God, and then the rest of it was usually, there were a couple of things where the whole thing was offered and everything got burnt up on the altar. But most things were, some portion of it goes on the altar, and then the rest of it is either used for the priest to feed them and sustain them, or is given back to the family to have a feast with, if it's a celebration offering. So there's several things that might happen, but you bring in your offerings and you go to the altar. And this is where most people went when they came into the tabernacle. They were there to offer an offering, and so they came to the altar. But then there's also this big round basin, or sea, as it was called, this brass or bronze basin that contained water for ritual purification, ritual cleansing. And if you were there for one of the rites of ritual cleansing that was required for various reasons, you would go to the basin and you would get your ritual cleansing. And this is where the people went. And then beyond this, there is this large kind of square to rectangular shaped building. It's basically a big tent. You think like a big fairgrounds tent, but not so gaudy in colors. And there's, again, specifications for how it's to be built. But there's this very large tent structure, and inside of it is several things, but most people don't go in here. This is set aside for the priests. Only the priests enter into the tabernacle proper. And you have the 7-branch candelabra, or the menorah, which is obvious from the drawing, right? You could tell that this was the candle. It's real rough. Y'all are probably kinder to my drawing than deserve. So you have the large candelabra that was always burning as long as the tabernacle was set up. And then you have the altar of incense, where incense was brought in by the priest and offered burnt up to just burning this incense and producing this cloud to go up before God. And then there was a table that was called the table of the presence, and there was a particular variety of bread that was manufactured, baked, and brought in and placed in the temple, or in the tabernacle, on the table of the presence. And the priest could eat from that, but it was a specific place that was set up, and under certain circumstances the priest could eat from it, called the table of the presence. And then there was this very thick, heavy curtain, or veil, it's called the curtain or the veil, that divided this area, which is called the holy place. This area that the priest could go is called the holy place. It divided the holy place from the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. And so there's this big curtain, big veil that separates these two sections, and the area on the other side of the curtain is smaller, and the only thing it contains is the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant is, again, its specifications and how it's supposed to be made and all is in Exodus, but it's basically a big wooden box that is covered over on all sides with gold, inside and out. There's gold plating or gold sheeting put on the inside and outside of this wood. And then there's a cover over the top of it that's called the atonement cover. And the cover is, again, wood covered in gold. And then on top of the wooden frame, or the wooden lid, is these two solid gold angel figures, cherubim, that have their arms stretched, or their wings stretched forward so that they touch. And it makes this kind of platform on the top, or visually it's a platform. There's nothing actually there to support. And that area at the top is called the mercy seat. And when the tabernacle is set up, and God's presence is going before them and leading the people by day as a pillar of cloud and by night as a pillar of fire. But when they stop, when the pillar stops leading them and stops telling them to go forward, they make camp. And when the tabernacle is set up, this pillar comes and rests in the tabernacle over this place. And so God's presence dwells over the ark in the Holy of Holies, in the most holy place. It's where God's presence is on earth. And later, instead of having the tabernacle, eventually under Solomon, they'll build the temple, but it's built according to the same pattern. Outer courtyard with altar and basin, holy place with all of these things, and then most holy place where the Ark of the Covenant sits and God's presence dwells on earth. And no one can enter it. If someone goes in and they're not prepared and they're not called in, they die because they've entered into the presence of God. And this Ark of the Covenant becomes is a very stark representation of God's presence. And if anyone mishandles it or touches it when they're not supposed to, they die. In fact, a little later in the Old Testament, there'll be a guy that is, they're not transporting the ark the way they're supposed to. They put it in an ox cart and are pulling it along, and something happens and it gets jostled, and the guy that's walking beside it is afraid it's going to fall over, and so he reaches out and touches the side of the ark to hold it up to keep it from falling over, and he drops dead. He was just trying to steady it, but he touched it when he wasn't supposed to, and he wasn't appropriate for touching it, and he died. And so God's presence is here, and God's presence is dangerous. And we'll find out in Leviticus, only on one day of the year, the high priest, one time, crawls in under the veil to offer one sacrifice after preparing himself all night long. And that's the only time anybody goes into the Holy of Holies, into the most holy place, because God's presence is there and is so dangerous. And then when you come to the New Testament, something happens. Jesus, New Testament, we got Jesus. Jesus is being crucified. He dies. And at the moment of his death, the Gospels describe this curtain that separates the holy place from the most holy place. It's extremely thick. Any light that comes through it means that it's not good enough. It has to be remade. This curtain is ripped in two from top to bottom. And the meaning or the theological understanding that comes from that is that at the moment of Christ's death, God tears the veil to show that there's no longer any need for a barrier between God's presence and his people. Because Jesus has fulfilled all of the law and taken away the need for a barrier. And now God's people can come into God's presence without fear. That's where we'll stop. That's where we'll end. And we'll pick up with Leviticus, the very last little snatch of Exodus that I didn't get to today, and Leviticus on Monday. We'll see y'all then.